and it's the idea of keeping them classified. The problem becomes when you don't have the requisite disciplines on a project, you don't gain the perspectives that are really necessary. For instance, being able to look at atmospheric effects with energy that also is transiting the Earth and living organisms on the Earth means you need electrophysiologists, it means you need earth scientists, it means you need radiochemists, you need other people that understand the relationships of that energy on living systems and other systems within the planet, and that does not happen. And we're talking about technologies that are designed specifically to interface and relate to, in a very powerful way, components of our environment. This is a very different kind of work than the mistakes we've made in the past with environmental consequences. This is deliberate manipulation of environmental components.
Right. I mean, the question is, would they dare to experiment with HAARP? I mean, for example, to give some perspective here, if we look at the record, for instance, of how the U.S. military, for instance, has experimented with, biological warfare on its own population, even in some instances. So the question is, would they not test an application like HAARP even within the U.S., maybe China or some other nation that potentially, is classified as a rogue nation by the, current administration, basically?
Well, the history is would say absolutely yes. And my family has been involved in Alaskan and American politics for over 50 years, and when I look at the history of our governments and others in these areas, of course, in the U.S., Secretary of Energy O'Leary, when she was working in that position under the Clinton administration, said over 500,000 Americans have been victims of human experiments within the boundaries of the United States over a 40-year period, and it involved all kinds of issues. In fact, we cite that in the book Earthrising the Revolution. And when we do our research and look at the history of the government and their own admissions, I'm amazed that within the boundaries of our country there's not more of an outcry, although that I think is changing. The abuses of government are what's driving a lot of the politics within the country right now. People are looking for real change and non-establishment candidates, whether they're Republican or Democrat. People are really looking for a big difference here, and I think that's probably not unique to our country. I think that happens and is happening literally around the world. There's more disclosures of what most of us would consider abuse of power, and these are just other examples of it. There's plenty of them to point to. And it's really about accountability. These are systems where now there needs to be a higher level of accountability within our own sovereign countries as well as internationally. And it's not unique to the U.S. Chinese military journals that we've read the translations of point to the same advances in these areas. In fact, at a very grand scale, people underplay the amount of money spent by the Chinese military. It's estimated to be around $50 billion.
Yeah.
Most people think of as small change, but in China it buys 10 times as much as the West, and so it is a significant budget. You get a lot more in China in production for that kind of money, and they are very, very quickly catching up with the West and will soon surpass us.
That doesn't sound good in any way,
Well, I mean, even the tour that's going on now, we have some joint military discussions going on with China where we're literally touring, and our officers are reporting back that they've grown much faster than anybody ever imagined. But it can only be expected. They have a tremendous productive capacity at a fraction of the cost of what European labor or American labor would even be.
Yeah, that's right. These are the things we are facing right now. One thing I want to ask a little bit about is the potential connection also between these kind of technologies and with the current climate change, so to speak, that we are experiencing. Some people would say that the whole global warming issue actually is not as serious as the powers that be and even the media are claiming to, that this isn't so severe. I'm thinking, I'm coming from another kind of perspective. I'm thinking that if there is an interest from someone to portray this as a real problem, I'm talking about global warming here, then these kinds of technologies could kind of help to implement that idea and even make it a reality. What's your thoughts on this?
Certainly they could aggravate it, but in terms of the trend line, and if you look at it, it's primarily what we're seeing on the planet driven by the sun, by solar activity and cycles that happen with fair regularity. In fact, I saw a very excellent BBC special on climate change, and I can say that it's going to go the opposite. It's going to be much faster than what's predicted. Our military released a classified document suggesting that what was proposed for the end of this century might actually be more in the 2020 range of timetables, which means we're in a dramatic shift. And in my part of the world, and I believe in your part of the world, you're probably seeing it in the Arctic, significant changes in terms of melting. I've seen it over my lifetime here in terms of the receding glaciers and what's happened in my region of the world. But staying fairly close to the ground in this part of the world, I know we are experiencing significant changes in climate. I think they're driven by geophysical processes within the planet itself. Undersea volcanics contributing a great deal, solar activity contributing a lot of energy. And on man's part on this, I think to some degree we're trying to figure out how to manipulate our system to benefit ourselves so we can get the water we want and deny the other guy, I guess, his access to it. But I think that's what's driving a lot of this experimental work. And I can see it. I mean, as a national priority for national security in every country, food security is directly related to climate. And so that's going to become important, increasingly so. And I think the timetables we're being given are wrong. I think it's going to be much quicker in terms of what we're experiencing. We're just beginning the new solar cycle now, and it's going to get even more energetic, which means we're going to see more extremes. And we've been saying this now for two decades. We said the 90s would be more severe than the 80s, and we said the first decade of this century would be significantly more severe than the 90s. And they have increased in terms of storm intensity and power significantly, and that trend line is not going to go away. In fact, it's probably going to accelerate. We're going to see more of it, not less of it. And I think a lot of it's going to be driven from undersea volcanics, and that will be discovered as time goes on in terms of contributing heat energy to the oceans that is 100% absorbed, unlike solar radiation, where only a small amount is absorbed at the surface and dissipates rather rapidly.
Yep, you're right. This is a very interesting perspective, and you're right about the solar cycle too, where we're going to probably approach the peak somewhere around 2011, 2012, something like that. And you also mentioned earthquake or volcanic, activity here. And you mentioned that this potentially also might be one thing that a technology like HAARP could help to induce. I don't know if that's the right word here, but do you think that this is also possible then, in another term, if we're speaking from a warfare kind of perspective, that a nation with this kind of technology actually can implement volcanic eruption or earthquakes in another country?
Sure, that is exactly the kind of technology that Secretary of Defense Cohen was talking about. And, and this concept actually goes back to another guy, G.F. Gordon MacDonald, who was a science advisor to President Johnson back in the 60s. He was also a full professor of geophysics at UCLA. And what he said is that we could manipulate. He wrote a chapter in a book called, the book is called Unless Peace Comes, and the chapter was How to Wreck Your Environment. And it was written in 1969 and talked about all of these things, creating earthquakes, climate change, being able to do it in a way that you could literally get a covert war. The last three U.S. Secretaries of Defense have called for the abrogation of that treaty dealing with environmental manipulation as a weapon of war, because our technology, as they've said, has advanced so dramatically that they want that capability now. And, just like the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistics Missile Treaty, I personally testified in the European Parliament, February 5th, 1998, and I had said, and it's in the record, that the U.S. would violate and dump the ABM Treaty within 1 year, based on new technologies of which HAARP was a part. And they did not agree with me. The committee objected to that point out of an hour and a half of testimony. The only point they objected to And then 9 months later, our prediction came true. And the European Parliament's Security and Disarmament Committee didn't have as good of intelligence on that issue as we did. In fact, the rationale that we suggested would be given was that there was no Soviet Union and therefore there was no treaty, which are almost identical to the words the U.S. Senator Ted Stevens uttered on the floor of the U.S. Senate 9 months later as we began to abandon and subsequently did abandon under the Clinton administration that treaty.
Very interesting. How come you were in the European Parliament? Were they investigating this or responsible for checking up on this? What was going on there?
Yeah, the Committee on Foreign Affairs, their subcommittee on Security and Defense Policy, the Subcommittee on Security and Disarmament, actually had a hearing that day, February 5th, 98, at 3 p.m. On HARP, and the heading of the hearing was called HARP: Pure Research, Star Wars Continuation, or Environmental Disaster. And then underneath it was non-lethal weapons, strategic, environmental, ethical, and human rights implications. And they brought myself and a number of others over to testify on this issue. They flew us in. We had an opportunity to meet with the committee for several hours the day before the hearing to brief them so that they could then, into the record, ask the appropriate questions and gain the record they were looking for. Later, in 1999, in January of 99, a resolution passed the European Parliament calling for investigation and a ban, and it was part of the most comprehensive resolution on security and disarmament the European Parliament has ever passed, their own record.
Interesting. And I mean, considering your knowledge and then this consequently this involvement with these committees that are looking into this, have you been approached by someone within, let's say, the Defense Department, the military, or anything like that? And have you been asked to kind of be quiet about it? What's going on there?
Well, no, actually not. They did send over someone from the State Department after our testimony and tried to discredit us, but it didn't work. And the resolution eventually passed, and it was European Parliament Resolution A/4005/99. It passed January 28th, 1999. The whole story we gave in the book, Earth Rising, the Revolution, Toward 1,000 Years of Peace, which is out now in German, just coming out this next year, in Bulgarian, and of course English, and in this one is also in Hungarian, of all languages. But when you look at all of the record on this, and what they did is they had 4 sections that dealt with the HARP issue, and then 1 section that dealt with this issue of mind effects, which we're going to talk about in the next segment, and I'll quote from that in the next segment. But the 3 sections dealing with HARP were actually passed by some of the largest margins of the entire resolution. It was a coalition of Greens, Social Democrats, and the work initiated by conservatives in Great Britain who were very concerned about the HARP issue. The Greens came in shortly thereafter, and the Social Democrats later, after several trips to Europe and meeting a number of the folks involved in the European Parliament at that time.
Very interesting. Nick, before we begin to round things up here for this segment, I want to ask you one final question, and then we move on to talk a little bit more about your website and so forth. But there was one document called Controlling the Weather, I think, 2025, the Weather as a Force Multiplier. This was released as an internal military memo document or whatever.
Right.
Have you been able to verify that and what has been discussed in there?
Oh yeah, it's all valid. In fact, we quoted extensively in the book Earth Rising: The Revolution Toward 1,000 Years of Peace, which we published back in 2000. You can get a lot of information on that on the website. But yes, that actual project was in fact looking for ways to do all kinds of weather modification, from creating fog to dissipating fog to establishing situations where you create rainfall. I mean, it was creating floods. I'm just looking at my notes on that particular document right now, and it's actually storm enhancement, precipitation denial, space weather for